One really good trick when you're navigating the various pitfalls and difficulties of life is to look for a parallel experience in the gospel, right? And so, for example, if you're dealing with a personal storm, if you will, in the context of your life, to look at stories in the gospel dealing with personal storms. And so, for example, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 8, where the Lord is asleep in the boat, or the Gospel of Matthew chapter 14, where the Lord is walking on the water. And so, for our purposes today, I want to focus simply on that second story. Again, this really famous story where Jesus is walking on the water in the context of the Gospel of Matthew chapter 14. So the first thing you'll notice with regards to the story is that Jesus actually sends his disciples into the midst of the storm, right? And so specifically what he does, he commands them to get into this boat and go ahead of him to the other side. But then by extension, he's basically sending them into the midst of the storm. And of course, the whole idea is that when it comes to God's providential designs, God's providence doesn't simply include the warm and fuzzy things that we experience in the context of our lives, but also our own personal storms. And so we can trust that, we can lean into that. To believe not simply that God can bring about good things from evil and difficult circumstances, but to believe on top of that, that everything is happening exactly as it's meant to play out, which speaks to the fact that God counts every hair on our head, and not even a single sparrow falls to the ground without the knowledge of our Father in heaven. Now that said, if you look at the corresponding version of the same story that you find in the Gospel of Mark chapter 6, what you'll find is that as the disciples are struggling through the midst of the storm, Jesus Christ is watching from afar. Which speaks to the fact that when it comes to our own kind of problems and difficulties in the context of this life, God truly sees everything to the last detail. And so he's not simply preoccupied with big things like world wars, world hunger, and the salvation of the world. Truly, he sees our situation in its great detail, and he cares about everything which happens to us because we are his children. Okay, now at this point, perhaps we might kind of shift gears, right? And so instead of focusing exclusively on issues of intention and purpose in terms of why God permits storms in the context of our lives, perhaps we might now shift our focus to timing, the timing by which God actually shows up in the midst of our storms. And so, for example, what you find in the Gospel of Mark chapter 6 is that Jesus Christ shows up at the fourth watch of the night. And so basically in biblical times, the day lasted from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., so a period of 12 hours. But then in contrast, the night was divided into 4 watches, each watch consisting of 3 hours. And so the first watch went from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., the second watch went from 9 p.m. to midnight, the third watch went from midnight to 3 a.m., and then finally the fourth watch lasted from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Now again, just to bring it back to the story, Jesus Christ actually appears to the disciples in the midst of the storm at the fourth watch of the night, somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. But you see, hold that thought and think about the corresponding version of the same story that you find in the Gospel of John chapter 6. And so basically what you hear in the Gospel of John is that Jesus Christ appears to his disciples after they have rowed for 25 and 30 furlongs. Now basically one single furlong works out to be between 220 and 225 yards. And so basically if you do the math, when Jesus Christ finally appears to his 12 disciples in the midst of the storm, they've been rowing for the equivalent distance of between 65 and 70 football fields. And of course, the cumulative effect of paying attention to these details pertaining to the furlongs or the fourth watch of the night is to suggest that basically God typically comes to us when we're at our wits' end, when we find ourselves at the very end of our own personal resources, if you will, such that when the Lord finally comes and saves us, we are abundantly clear that it is the Lord as opposed to something else which actually saves us. But that, of course, brings us to the particular manner in which Jesus actually makes himself manifest to the disciples in the midst of the storm. And so the first thing you'll notice is that Jesus is seen walking on the water, which is no small detail. And so the water, and in particular the sea in the biblical imagination, represented chaos and evil in the world, right? And so for Jesus Christ to be walking on the water demonstrates his mastery over the forces of chaos in the world, things which we tend to be afraid of, right? And so by extension, he's revealing that actually I am the Lord your God. But then, of course, on top of that, he emerges from the very heart of the storm, from the very heart of the thing which the disciples think is about to kill them, as a result of which they cry out in fear and exclaim, "It is a ghost." In response to which the Lord says, of course, "Have courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Now, of course, when the disciples ultimately recognize that truly it is the Lord, they invite him into their boat, in the aftermath of which the storm is immediately calmed, and the disciples ultimately exclaim, "Truly, this is the Son of God." And of course, this speaks to the fact that when we ourselves are wrestling with our own kind of personal storms, ironically, the way to discover Christ in the midst of these things is not to run away from the difficulties of our lives, but instead to actually lean into these things. Because again, sometimes, oftentimes, the way that you find Christ is to look for him in the very heart of the thing which you think is going to destroy you. Okay, now obviously there's kind of a lot going on here, but perhaps I might leave you with 2 kind of clear takeaway messages, if you will, based on 2 really important details in the story. And so if you look at the corresponding version of the story that you find in the Gospel of Mark, actually, Gospel of Mark chapter 6, what you'll find is that the story ends with this commentary that the disciples did not yet understand the miracle of the loaves, which obviously refers to the preceding story of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish. And so, as you might recall, with regards to that prior story, not just the 12 disciples, but basically 5,000 people have left everything to follow the Lord, to linger in his presence, to listen to his word, as a result of which they're hungry. And so Jesus Christ multiplies the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He gives them to his disciples to in turn give to the people, and the people are fed. But that said, the thing I want you to notice with regards to the story, again, the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, is that the only reason why these people are hungry is because they've left their homes to follow the Lord, which speaks to the fact that truly, if you follow the path of discipleship to its natural ends, many times you will find yourself in a position of extreme need, which in turn requires the Lord to step in a dramatic sort of way to basically save you. And of course, the whole point is that when you find yourself in your own kind of personal storms, remember these 2 stories, the multiplication of the loaves and fish and the story of Jesus walking on the water. And in particular, even though it sounds weird, remember that it gives great glory to God the Father when you fully expect that he will save you when you find yourself in difficult circumstances, which you're only in because you're following the path of discipleship. Okay, but that brings us to the final point I want to make with regards to the story of Jesus walking on water, and this pertains to the person of St. Peter. And so, as you might recall, in the context of this particular story, once Jesus clearly identifies himself in the midst of the storm, Peter says to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to walk in the water." And of course, the Lord beckons him to come, and Peter starts walking in the water. But then he notices the sound of the wind, he notices the waves, he starts to sink because he's afraid. And of course, as you all know, as Peter begins to sink, he cries out to the Lord immediately saves him, pulls him to safety, and then says to him, "Ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, maybe it's just me, but whenever I think about this particular scene, I always think about the other disciples in the boat. And I kind of ask myself, like, what were they thinking when they saw Peter basically sink and then subsequently be rebuked by the Lord? They were probably thinking some variation of like, gosh, I'm glad that wasn't me, right? I'm glad that wasn't me. I'm glad I stayed in the boat. But that's why it's really helpful to be aware of the rest of the story. And so if you think about it, there's actually been many times throughout the gospel when Peter has been utterly humiliated before the Lord. So think about the calling of St. Peter, "Depart from me, Lord, from a sinful man." Think about Caesarea Philippi, right? "Get behind me, Satan, you become a stumbling block to me." Think about Holy Thursday, where St. Peter denies the Lord 3 times, the last time to a mere servant girl. And again, think about this particular story where, again, Jesus says to Peter, "Ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" And so over and over again throughout the course of the gospel, there's this recurring pattern where Peter is humiliated and subsequently rebuked by the Lord. But then, of course, how does the story ultimately end? Jesus Christ picks this guy, St. Peter, to be the first pope, the first leader of the fledgling church before all these other disciples. And why? Well, in a certain sense, because these other guys basically stayed in the boat. And you see, it speaks to the fact that in order to become the persons that God is calling us to be, we constantly need to put ourselves out there. To put ourselves in the midst of storms, to put ourselves out there in terms of walking at the water at the Lord's command, even though there's this great risk that we might fall and sink, if you will. And so if you think about it, shades of 1 Samuel chapter 6, which speaks to the fact that God doesn't look to the outward appearance, but instead he looks to the heart. What's the heart of this person who's striving to grow in discipleship and trying to grow in love of me? And you see, practically speaking, what this means is that if you're trying your best to go God's way, and again, you're trying your best to become the person he's calling to be, a lot of times you're going to find yourself in the midst of storms, in the midst of confusion, in the midst of difficulty, taking 1 step back in favor of ideally taking 2 steps forward. And you might look like an idiot in the process, and the world will judge you and kind of say, like, what are you doing? You got to trust and believe that in the midst of these harrowing circumstances, even though people will always judge you based on the outward appearance, God always looks to the heart. And the fact of the matter is that God always cherishes and values his beloved children who try to pursue him with sincerity and humility. And may God bless you all.